Lady Franklin Bay, the famous stories, the famous catastrophes of Arctic exploration. Welcome to this talk. Look forward to telling you about the Greely expedition. Let me start by mentioning briefly my gratitude to the Balch Library for letting me talk to you. Susie and I lived at Spinks Ferry for almost 30 years. We used the libraries of Loudoun County and the city of Leesburg extensively during that period. A lot of help from librarians, Una Pilot, one of them, Betsy Quinn, another. I'd like to just put out a thank you to both of them for that service. We will be talking today about the Greely expedition, Voyage to an Enchanted Land, an expedition down the Amazon River, October the 20th. A young man named William Herndon did that expedition. The last talk will be Lost in the Ice on November 11th. Okay, let's begin. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition, 1881-1884. I started the research on this for an article I wrote in Naval History magazine some years ago. Those of you who are interested in naval history or maritime history more generally, if you're unfamiliar with this monthly magazine, a publication of the United States Naval Institute, I invite it to your attention. Beginning in the 15th century, explorers moved out into the broad ocean waters of the world, looking for access from Europe to the Orient. Their search was for the products of the Orient and the markets of the Orient. And the first of these efforts, familiarly, is that of Christopher Columbus, and that blue arrow there shows his confident departure from Spain, heading for what he was sure was China. He was unaware, of course, that the fact that the distance was vast and obstructed by two continents. Other efforts also to reach the Orient followed. The Portuguese went around the tip of Africa, heading for the markets and riches of the Orient. Others went around the tip of South America into the Pacific, heading to the same direction. And finally, there were efforts across the top of the continents, looking for a northeast passage, that blue line across the top of what is today Scandinavia and Russia, and the red line across the northern continent, northern North American continent. All of this effort was a determined push for wealth. It was not politically inspired so much as it was economically inspired. Of these, and the reason why it's in red, some of the most interesting efforts to reach the Orient were those that involved a search for the Northwest Passage, a passage across the top of the North American continent to reach what was presumably Asian waters, Asian markets, and the Asian peoples. These expeditions looking for the Northwest Passage went on for well over a century. They littered the continent, the North American continent, with the bodies of the dead. Ironically, or perhaps not ironically, it is now possible, or it was just before COVID and will be again, it is now possible for you and I to book a cruise ship to sail the fabled Northwest Passage, although for the most part they're now going northeast across that passage. Anyway, we'll be talking about one of the expeditions that pushed hard to open this passage. Let's focus for just a few minutes on Sir John Franklin. This is a painting of Sir John, British naval officer, Royal Navy officer, who famously led an expedition searching for the Northwest Passage in HMS Erebus and HMS Terror in 1845. Sir John had a fabulous Navy career. He was on board the Bellerophon during the Battle of Trafalgar, the historic Battle of Trafalgar. He commanded His Majesty's ship Trent. He was involved in several Canadian expeditions, again, seeking out the Northwest Passage, although in his case, at least once, he was going northeast across the continent. He was, for a while, for a period of several years, the governor of the prison, Van Diemen's Land, and that was an unsuccessful assignment. He subsequently moved on to that at the age of 59, commanded two-ship squadron, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Royal Navy sent out once again, seeking the Northwest Passage. This is the crew list of Erebus and Terror, taken from the documents at the Royal at the Library in London. It shows the officers there, led by Sir John Franklin, now 59, well past his prime, and really a poor choice to have led such a challenging expedition. The story is that his second wife was successfully politically pushed him into the assignment, looking for a way to restore his and her reputation and his and her fortune. This is a picture of St. John, painted by Louis Hagen. Painting of HMS Terror and HMS Erebus in the frozen waters of the Canadian Arctic. This will, as you're suspecting by now, end very badly. Both ships will be caught in the ice, seemingly disappear. There will be no survivors of this expedition at all. What we have reconstructed is the ships caught in the ice, the crews abandoned it, heading south, hoping to get to a fur trading station to be saved. None of them survived. Lady Jane Franklin, here's a picture of her. She was a very forceful woman, unkindly described as a man in petticoats. Lady Jane raised a monument to her husband. The monument says incorrectly that he pioneered the finding of the Northwest Passage. There's a book by Ken McGugan, Lady Franklin's Revenge, that tells her story. A fascinating woman, enormous influence and enormous interest. She launched some 40-odd Arctic expeditions after her husband disappeared in an effort to find out what happened, to rescue them, or at least to find out what happened, cover the bodies, and whatever else they were able. This is a map showing some of those expeditions between 1850 and 1859. That's Canada today, obviously, and you can see the lines there showing the many expeditions that she launched. The Franklin expedition is described wonderfully well in a book called Ice Blink by Scott Cookman. These are the waters in which the expedition operated. And what's interesting to us right now, in the last 10 years, both HMS Terror and HMS Erebus, the wrecks of both have been found, and we'll talk about that. In 1879, a young Austro-Hungarian lieutenant, he was a lieutenant in the Navy of Austria-Hungary, named Karl Lakerick, came up with the idea of establishing an international polar geographical conference. Lakerick is notable principally because he had the wit to name islands that you see circled there for the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph. So he named that Franz Joseph land. Those are a cluster of islands north of Russian-owned now and north of Russia today. But his idea of establishing an international polar conference, after a few years, stuck. And the result was soon a conference to understand weather, the geography, the geology, and the conditions in the pole. While this is percolating, while his concept is percolating, the United States Navy sends a small ship, USS Jeannette, out of San Francisco, up through the Bering Strait, into polar waters. That expedition is described in a book by Hampton Sides called In the Kingdom of Ice. Jeannette's mission is to demonstrate that there is, in fact, warm water at the pole and that it is possible for ships to navigate across the pole. This is, of course, complete fiction, but at the time, it was believed to be true that a Jeannette expedition will turn out to be a catastrophe. Before we get into that, its origin is in the person of James Gordon Bennett Jr. You see him there. James Gordon Bennett was the publisher of the New York Herald newspaper. This was a circulation building exercise, just as his exercise to send an expedition into Central Africa famously was an exercise in circulation building for his newspaper. On the right is George DeLong, who commanded USS Jeannette, left as Secretary of the Navy at the time. This is the Jeannette expedition. She will proceed north into the Bering, be caught in the ice, and crushed. It's a beautiful painting down there left showing you that. At this moment now, we are in June 1881 at perhaps the post-Civil War low point of the United States Navy, of its reputation, of its competence at sea, of its ability to perform its missions, of the size of the fleet, the condition of the fleet. Here on in, things will get better, but for the moment, thanks to Jeanette being crushed in the ice and her entire crew being forced across the ice, seeking land, seeking to get to Siberia, and some few will survive that experience, incidentally. We were talking a moment ago about James Gordon Bennett, the entrepreneur, the impresario of this catastrophe. Bennett is much more famously known, and you will know him for this, as having been the one who sent Henry Morgan Stanley across Africa in search of Dr. Livingstone. That famous moment where Stanley greets Livingstone with the phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. This was an exercise funded by James Gordon Bennett to build the circulation. Really good books on this subject, both by Tim Geel. One is called Stanley, the other Livingstone. The map at the bottom left shows you Stanley's crossing of Africa in search of Dr. Livingstone. Lieutenant Carl Wakefield succeeds, as I suggested to you, and in 1882-83, the powers of Europe determined on inaugurating the first international polar year. And what they proposed to do is establish 12 stations around the North Pole. The map in the middle shows you the North Pole and these stations surrounding it. At the bottom of the location of those stations. And the two I would wish to point out to you are the American stations. Number 7 is at Point Barrow, Alaska, and number 9 is at Fort Conger, Canada, on the shores of Lady Franklin Bay. These are the two American stations. They will collect data on weather conditions, on magnetic storms, on magnetic conditions, temperatures, barometric pressures, all kinds of data associated with understanding the Arctic. The pictures to either side are some representative cottages, conditions under which these people live. These are 12 stations. There are over 700 men involved in the operation of these Arctic stations. And the one that we will focus on is the station number 9, and that is the expedition that we're discussing. The expedition will be under the overall command of Major General William Hazen, United States Army. There are his dates. Hazen is chief of the Signal Corps. The Signal Corps, for the 20 years up until this date, has been the U.S. government agency collecting weather data, meteorological data. And that's because they have the telegraphic systems to report this data to a central point. It will be some 10 years after this before weather forecasting and weather services in general are reassigned to a civilian department of the U.S. government. Hazen is in charge of the effort to establish these American stations around the pole. He's very uninterested in this process, does it very reluctantly, and it is because of his reluctance, in part, that these stations and this effort will be very significantly underfunded. Hazen at the time works for Robert Lincoln, Secretary of War Lincoln. Those are the dates up there on the left. First for President Garfield and then for President Chester Arthur when Garfield dies in 81. Robert Lincoln, in passing, you will recall, is the only child of President Abraham Lincoln who survived childhood. Lincoln also will be very skeptical about this entire effort. He has very little interest in supporting it. Consequently, it will be underfunded dramatically, and that underfunding is part of the reason for how this will all come out. They will select a young Army officer, Adolphus Washington Greely, 1844-1935 were his dates. A picture of the two books he published, a two-volume book on his years of Arctic service. Greely is a fascinating figure. He commanded a black infantry unit during the Civil War. He will go on to lead this expedition. He will go on to be in charge of the United States Weather Service. He will be the senior officer present during the Great Earthquake in San Francisco, awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he lies today at a tombstone at Arlington National Cemetery. Very interesting figure. He will command this expedition. Its results will be catastrophic. One of its few survivors. Books that he published about it and about the Arctic in general, important part of our exploration history. I'm going to show you some maps quickly to give you a sense of the location of this. There is Arctic Canada, North Pole, right at the center of this presentation. And it is there in Arctic Canada on the shores of Lady Franklin Bay. Just a moment. On the shores of Lady Franklin Bay, that Greely's fort, his base up there, you see it on the top of this, Fort Conger, will be established between 1881 and 1884. Just for reference, you see down below where Franklin was lost, and the line across the middle is the first successful Northwest Passage by McClure is his name up there. In 1850, although the passage was not from east to west, but it was from west to east. Anyway, Greely's camp, Fort Conger on Lady Franklin Bay, encamped there between 1881 and 1884. Perhaps an easier way to look at this is with a Google Earth map. You see how far north Lady Franklin Bay is. There are various other points on this chart as time goes on. The significance of Lady Franklin Bay was a deliberate effort to put it as far north as possible, to study the conditions as near to the north as possible. But coincidentally, a seam of coal had been found at the site through an expedition some years earlier. The idea to locate this base next to a coal seam is obviously a good one to provide heat during the course of the long winters they were expected to. Another graphic I will show you a little bit more detail, the region that was there and the area in which this camp was. Here we get a close-up, better look at it. The support of this expedition will be based in St. John's, Newfoundland. The support vessel, SS Proteus, the steamer Proteus, former whaler, all the vessels that will move up and down the bay here, either whalers or sealers, because only these ships are sufficiently reinforced to deal with the ice that's experienced. St. John's, Newfoundland, Proteus will leave July the 7th, 1881, with Greely and his party aboard. They will arrive very easily through good weather conditions and good sea conditions at Lady Franklin Bay in mid-August 1881 to establish the camp and begin the process. The concept is that the camp is established by Greely and his team August 1881. Resupply vessel will proceed there in the summer of 1882. That resupply fails to reach him, they will cache food stocks at some designated points along the Canadian coast. In the summer of 1883, another vessel will proceed up to the camp and withdraw the team back to the United States based on all their data. So that's the idea. It will go terribly wrong. What will happen instead is the first resupply mission, the summer mission of 82, never reaches Camp Conger. It fails to reach it because of ice conditions in the strait. And it leaves a remarkably small cache of supplies at the designated point. And then it withdraws, that resupply expedition withdraws, leaving essentially some few hundred rations at a cache along the coast. Greely understood that this was possible. His instructions were to remain through the first summer, to expect a resupply mission, to remain into the second summer when he would be withdrawn with another steamer. His instructions are, if that second summer the steamer does not appear, he is to withdraw with his men in their small boats down the coast, stopping at these designated cache points where supplies were supposed to have been left by the two vessels who should have moved up through the summer to do that. There's some really good books on the subject. You see them there. Alden Todd's book, Abandoned, late Leonard Guttridge's book, The Ghosts of Cape Sabine. The reference to Cape Sabine is that's the camp that ultimately this team will withdraw to and hole up for 10 miserable months while they waited for rescue. So what happens is they get there in 81. They're supposed to be resupplied in 82. That doesn't happen. They're supposed to be collected in 83, but the vessel sent to get them gets caught in the ice, crushed and sunk, and they withdraw themselves over water in small boats, over land by foot, into an encampment, hoping for rescue. Miserable conditions, as you might expect. This is the top left is the entire team of men that go on this expedition. Greely is there sitting in the middle, first row with a handsome beard. There actually were several Eskimos with this group. They were there to help with the sled dogs, and they are nowhere mentioned in any of the books, in any of the articles written about this. I presume they were lost with the rest of the expedition who died, and nothing is said about it. In any case, there's Greely and his team of young Signal Corps people, together with a civilian doctor, Pavey. This is some of the scientific equipment they had. This is the cottage, the camp they were to live in for a 2-year period. That hut was brought up prefabricated to establish the camp. A number of small tents on the outside of it holding technical equipment as well. The idea was they would collect data on temperature, atmospheric pressure, weather conditions, magnetic conditions, and so on. Left is the cabin, prefabricated cabin was built to hold this entire party. Bottom right is Greely's little corner, his command corner, so upper right too, of that cabin. And it was there that they were going to live for several years, collecting this precious data. Is the American contribution. That's just a beauty shot there showing you Dallas, the campsite. One of the things that made this so difficult, of course, is they were going to be in near perfect darkness for many, many months of the year. And they would do that twice. Greely's book talks very evocatively, very descriptively, of the crushing burden of darkness day after day, night after night, and the fear that it engenders, the irrational fear that it engenders in people, that the sun will never return, will never have light. Winter and darkness will persist forever. The expedition's purpose was to collect important scientific data, but there was another purpose as well. And that was to establish a record for the farthest north. That record was essentially to put a marker up that the United States was in the business of polar exploration seriously. The goal was to proceed farther north than anyone had been before, record held by Great Britain up until this point. Kissling-Berry was the second in command of the expedition. He would lead the effort to establish a new farthest north. Dr. Octavio Pavey on the left there is the civilian I mentioned earlier. He is the medical doctor who will accompany the expedition and die with the expedition. Farthest north effort starts by dog sled, March 19th, 1882, and it will succeed handsomely, establishing a new record position in the north. This is the whole area. This is Greely's camp at Fort Conger Bay, Fort Conger on Bay, and I'll show you in a moment where the farthest north point was. Here they are establishing that with the dog sled team led by Lieutenant James Lockwood, and as I say to you, several Eskimos as well that tragically are nameless in this process. But they will succeed in establishing this farthest north point and in wresting the record away from Great Britain in the summer of 1882. Here is that point in northern Greenland, 83 north, 83 and change north. It will be called the Conger Inlet, 83, 24 north, and that being established puts the United States proudly holding for reaching the closest to the pole. In 1882, the steamer Neptune is sent out for the first resupply mission. Neptune doesn't get anywhere near where she's supposed to. She doesn't get near Fort Conger. She drops her rations short at Cape Sabine, some 150 miles more short from where she was supposed to go. This is the geography of that. So there they drop off some rations, turn around, and proceed back. The next year will be no more successful. They will drop off rations a couple of 100 miles farther south, under the leadership of Lieutenant Ernest Garlington, United States Army, who tries manfully with a two-ship force, Proteus and Yantic, to make up all the way up to Fort Conger. Proteus, the vessel that first brought the team into position, is this summer in 83 caught in the ice, crushed, and sinks. Following his instructions, that same summer, the team leaves Fort Conger to proceed by small boat and ultimately by foot south. This is Caldwell who led this particular effort in this ship. Proteus is crushed July 23rd, sinks with everything on board except very limited stocks that they were able to offload. There she is going down. There will be a court of inquiry and all of this that will establish how inadequately expedition was supported. Greely and his team will abandon Fort Conger, proceed in the little boats they have and the launches that they have, a steam launch and another launch, proceed down, heading for, they hope, a resupply vessel and the caches that have been left for them. This is the little steam launch they have, towing another boat, and they will carry all the men of the expedition and food supplies that are remaining, in the hopes of getting far enough south to be picked up and returned home. The retreat from Fort Conger to Cape Sabine is mapped here. They will end up ashore at Cape Sabine, still hundreds of miles south of where they started, but substantially north of where they had intended to be, down in Newfoundland. We'll build a camp at Cape Sabine. It is the camp in which the survivors of the expedition will hole up waiting rescue. This is a map that shows you the small boat's course heading down the Canadian coast, ultimately to the camp. They will hole up in it. Let me show you a picture of that camp. What they do is dig out a small square area. They surround it with rock. They take one of their whale boats, one of the whale boats that they used to come down the coast with, flip it upside down to act as sort of a partial roof, and they will live in this hot, icy ground for 10 months, waiting rescue, desperately waiting rescue, slowly starving to death. This is an interior illustration of that taken in a magazine article, and it's fairly well representative of the conditions under there. People lying side by side in what amounts to sleeping bags, holed up with very inadequate food supplies. They manage to kill a polar bear. They live on some Arctic shrimp, and they turn horrifically, will be observed, rescued, they turn horrifically to cannibals. There's some evidence, good evidence, that 7 of the men posthumously subjected. Here's some illustrations showing that period, the first burial there in 1884. There will be more to come. A rescue party will finally be launched by the United States Navy under the Commander Winfield Shelley. This will be a brilliant success. It will be the start of the recovery of the U.S. Navy's reputation following that generation-long collapse that I mentioned to you at the conclusion of the American Civil War. Shelley will lead the expedition that will stumble is unfair, that will find the survivors holed up in that camp I showed you. And that triumph, the Navy will exploit dramatically to get funding, to improve its reputation, and to be restored in the eyes of the American public. Shelley will write a book on this achievement called The Rescue of Greely. That book is available online, as is every other one I've told. This will be accomplished in the steamer Bear, another one of these Arctic fishing vessels, and sailing in Bear, he will proceed up towards the campsite and put parties ashore, and those parties happily, Thetis and Bear, the two ships, those parties happily will find Greely's men holed up, having first found a cache where Greely left a letter indicating where he was. These are illustrations of that rescue party. HMS Alert is the British Royal Navy's contribution to this rescue. Here we have the illustration of the geography of this. The rescue will have started in St. John's. It will end up proceeding as you see it, and then they will come down the coast, Littleton Island, and finally further down the coast in June of 1884, where they will find Greely's men. Under the leadership of John Caldwell, he will find first a cache on the ground. Inside of that cache, there will be a letter from Greely reporting where his men are, and Caldwell and others will find the encampment and will rescue the survivors. There, in the picture in the bottom center, is Greely as he looked when rescued. The illustrations are from magazines and other news stories showing the discovery and in the camp. The greeting on arrival, some publicity photography associated with that discovery. Mind you, these men have spent 10 months holed up on the ground in the Arctic. The survivors are about a third of the total number. This photograph here is the Navy's photo of the successful rescue. Greely is sitting in the middle, right there on the deck, a guy with a beard and a watch hat. The men below him, immediately around him, are the 6 other survivors in the expedition. The rest of the men have frozen to death or starved to death. Everyone else in this picture are the U.S. naval officers associated with the rescue of the Greely expedition. That young man, bearded young man on the top right, is Lieutenant Emery Taunt, and I identify him to you only because Taunt will die in the Congo a few years' time as a civilian, and I wrote a book about him called Congo. It's the same Emery Taunt who participated in its rescue. The picture of men sitting in the top left represent the entire crew that Greely had with him. I'll show you in a moment who survived and who didn't, but the 2 green boxes are significant. William Cross, box on the left, is the first to die. He died January 18th, 1884. Cross is buried about a quarter mile from where Susie and I live. He's buried in the Congressional Cemetery. The other day, we went out, found his tombstone. That's a very bad picture of the text of the tombstone. And there I am with our 2 Labrador retrievers standing next to the tombstone. Cross was the first to die. Charles Henry, Private Charles Henry, was shot June the 6th, 1884. In a firing squad, he was tried and convicted for stealing foodstuffs. So those are 2 who died in the expedition. The others, the many others, you'll see in just a moment. The photograph on the right shows Greely and 5 other survivors. There were 7 men originally recovered in that encampment, but one of the 7 died almost immediately, a victim of frostbite. So who we have left out of this entire population on the top left are just the guys circled in. Those are the survivors of the Greely expedition. Sergeant Brainerd is one of the survivors. He was in the expedition that established the farthest north. Here's a picture of him as a young man and a picture of Brainerd on his 80th anniversary being inducted into the American Polar Society. He was the only survivor of the farthest north expedition. The centennial of the Greely expedition, the United States Postal Service published its first day cover and a stamp. It's kind of a handsome stamp. I started out talking to you about HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The Canadian government in the last decade started a serious search for these vessels in an effort to establish where they were, what had happened, what might have happened to the survivors, and further with the political goal of reinforcing its claim to certain Arctic waters. So in the last decade, the search was very seriously mounted. HMS Erebus, HMS Terror, and quite remarkably, both of them were found. Erebus first and Franklin's flagship Terror second. Both of them were found, clearly identified. The chart there shows you where they were. And watch this for just a moment. This is HMS Erebus, found in 2015, April 2015. This is some video photography of the wreckage and some other pictures of it. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but it will show you the success in locating first of these 2 vessels. It was for a period of time a notion that what had caused the death of the crew was lead poisoning. They had been sent to Canada with canned foods. Canning food was a new process then, and the solder that was used on the cans contained lead, and the idea was perhaps they were all poisoned by lead. Very difficult to establish. The judgment now is that that is not what had happened, but there is no baseline for the level of lead in the bodies of Britons from that period because of mining and all kinds of other pollution sources. The judgment is it was likely pretty high anyway, so it's not possible to establish that this was the cause of their problems. The cause of their problems, quite frankly, was Arctic conditions.
It appears to be in pristine condition. Eerie underwater images show the ship's mast still standing and a trove of historical artifacts inside. The Terror was discovered in the icy waters of Nunavut on the south shore of King William Island in the aptly named Terror Bay. It was a tip from this man, Inuit crew member Sammy Kovic, whose local knowledge proved invaluable.
The images are simply stunning. A ship's helm in remarkable condition and nearly pristine wood planking. Kovic mentioned the story to Shignowski, who diverted the research boat to take a look. What they found was a ship with all 3 masts broken but standing and hatches closed, suggesting the crew of the Terror may have buttoned down the vessel for the winter.
So we began by talking about the great thrust across the top of the North American continent, looking to reach the markets and the treasures of the Orient. Part of that thrust I suggested to you, I told you, was Erebus and Terror still seeking the Northwest Passage. That was background for the much more general, much broader scientific effort to understand polar conditions and simultaneously to figure out, is there a way across those waters? Our conversation led to the Greely expedition, a catastrophe at many levels. Very little interesting or good came of it, although the United States got bragging rights to the farthest north in 8324 for a little while. Greely established his reputation as a very hard man. His second in command, Lieutenant Kisslinger, that I told you about, had written a diary while he was up there, The diary was exceedingly critical of Greely, but people overlooked that, and they overlooked it, I think, rightly. Greely did an astonishing job. He subsequently ended up in command of the United States Signal Corps. He was, as I mentioned, the senior officer present in San Francisco during the Great Earthquake, and went on to a brilliant career, uniformed and as an author. Behind him lay the catastrophe of the expedition he led, when poorly conceived and badly supported. For a very brief period of time, another 10 years, the U.S. Signal Corps was in charge of weather forecasting and weather transmissions of the United States government. That was transferred to civilian agencies at the same time that those agencies got access to the telegraphic system that permitted the movement quickly from station to station and place to place. If books that I've mentioned to you in the presentation interest you, and I would hope they do, you'll be able to find them online. There's some really good writing about explorations and expeditions, specifically about the Greely expedition, about the Franklin expedition, and about the general thrust in Canada. I spend my time researching and writing maritime history books. I've written 7 illustrations. The cover illustrations are there. 8th will be published by the University of Alabama Press, I hope quite soon. It is the fascinating true story of the wreck USS armored cruiser Memphis, known for most of her life as USS Tennessee, mysteriously wrecked on the beach at Santo Domingo during the early years of the war. My other books are Adak, the true story of a Navy fleet that went down off of Soviet Kamchatka, Sailors in the Holy Land, an expedition in 1848 the United States Navy sent to places the Dead Sea, The Last Lincoln Conspirator, the story of John Surratt, his flight from trial, his capture in Egypt, his return for trial for the assassination of Lincoln. Horrible Shipwreck is a story of a female convict transport on the way to the Australian penal colony that ran aground in France with the loss of everybody, almost everybody. I've already mentioned to you Congo. The story of Lieutenant Emery Taunt was on board the rescue of Greely, went on to explore the Congo River Basin, returned to the Congo as the first American diplomat to that part of Africa, died there of disease and alcohol soon thereafter. Black Rock and Blue Water is the story of a mail ship that ran aground in the Caribbean during a horrific hurricane. And the last one is Embassy to the Eastern Courts, the American Navy expedition to establish trade relationships in the Arabian Sea, South Pacific Ocean. I hope these subjects interest you, or more generally, the naval history and maritime history interests you. I find them fascinating. Thank you for your time and attention today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you, provided by the library, the town of Leesburg Library and its staff. Thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that very informative presentation. If you have any questions, please start putting them in the chat box. And while people are putting their questions in, I will get it started. You do very significant research for all of your presentations and books. For this specific topic, while you were doing your research, was there anything that really surprised you? Something that you didn't expect while you were doing your research?
Research about expeditions in the Arctic generally ends very badly, and that part did not surprise me. What I thought quite remarkable was the personality of Greely himself. This was an enormously durable, enormously tough, first young man, finally old man. As a quick sketch of his subsequent career, I hope left you in mind. He was also very, very articulate. He wrote a number of books, and some of his work focused on explanations of why Arctic research was important, why it was we needed to know about conditions in these horrific latitudes. So that's not so much a surprise, but it fascinated me that Greely, although on its face an odd choice for a job, he'd never done anything like this expedition before, turned out to be quite a remarkable figure and a fascinating man in his own right.
You mentioned that there were inquiries into a couple of aspects of this expedition, and that he later on went to be involved with the U.S. Weather Bureau and the earthquake in San Francisco, and then he wrote books about some of the things he was involved in, including this expedition. Was there ever any negative reaction from the government or any pushback from anything that he wrote about in his own personal reminiscence of what happened?
Not what he wrote about. The real effort inside of government was to examine how come this had become such a catastrophe. There was a very serious look at why the support to this expedition had been so inadequate. What were the problems inside of the Signal Corps? Signal Corps General was court-martialed for his role in this process. There were some serious congressional investigations as to what had gone wrong. This kind of a catastrophe stirs up a whole lot of interest and a lot of special pleading and argument. And all of that accompanied this. The Signal Corps was restructured, reorganized. Hazen lost his job. Others were moved in. Fundamentally, though, the problem was broader than just the Signal Corps. The support from Lincoln, Secretary of War, was very limited. He was very disinterested. He had no interest whatever in the idea that the Signal Corps was going to be doing this. And as a consequence, everything was underfunded right up until the end, when the Navy took over the rescue and spent money heroically. It's astonishing how little was spent before and how much was spent later. And it was, as it always is, a final analysis, a demonstration of the resources to do the job. If you have them, good leadership will get you there. If you don't have those resources, leadership is less significant, the outcome is likely to be. Anybody else?
Well, those seem to be all of our questions for today. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please join us for our next presentation with Andrew Jampoler on October 20th, Voyage Through an Enchanted Land. Please make sure to pre-register for that. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you so much.
Let me take just a minute to say that those of you who may be watching from Herndon, you will learn things about the name of your town and about its namesake that I think are fascinating. Exceedingly brave young man died tragically in another story that's told by a brilliant book, Ship of Gold in the Deep Blue Sea. Thanks. I look forward to talking to you next month.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.